The gavel cracked like thunder, echoing across the chamber. Judge Thomas leaned forward, his voice cold and unflinching as he delivered the unthinkable. Representative Jasmine Crockett is hereby fined $500 million. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Then, like a ripple across still water, the gasps began. Murmurs of disbelief, shock reverberating through every corner of the room. Reporters scrambled for their phones, cameras zoomed in, and social feeds lit up like wildfire. $500 million, an amount so staggering it was less a fine and more a declaration of war. This wasn't just about a legal penalty. This was humiliation weaponized, power flexed in its most brazen form. The crowd knew it. The country watching on screens knew it. Millions of people who had seen Jasmine as a voice of dignity and defiance felt the blow as if it had been struck against them. Parents whispered to their children, activists clenched their fists, and ordinary citizens sat frozen in disbelief. A judge had turned the scales of justice into a hammer of intimidation. Thomas, draped in the authority of his robe, seemed to relish the silence he commanded. His smirk suggested triumph, a reminder that in his courtroom, power was absolute. But in that silence, something else was stirring, a tension heavier than the ruling itself. It was the weight of expectation, the unspoken question. How could anyone rise from a blow like this? $500 million was designed to break even the strongest, to crush not just Jasmine but the spirit of those she represented. Yet there she sat, unflinching. Her eyes didn't dart, her hands didn't tremble. While the chamber buzzed with shock, Jasmine's composure was its own quiet rebellion. In that calm, there was a promise. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of despair. And as cameras zoomed tighter, the story that began as her punishment was already transforming into something far larger. Across the nation, screens flickered with the moment, and conversations erupted. Was this justice or persecution? Was this America's system protecting its dignity, or exposing its corruption? The stakes were no longer confined to four walls. They had spilled into every living room, every phone, every heart that yearned for fairness. But no one, neither Judge Thomas, nor the stunned crowd, nor the millions watching at home, was ready for how Jasmine would respond. The ruling didn't exist in a vacuum. It wasn't just a courtroom spat over procedure or paperwork, it was the culmination of years of tension, of a system bending under the weight of its own contradictions. $500 million wasn't simply a fine. It was a message, a warning sent through Jasmine to every voice that dared to challenge entrenched power. To some, it read like a headline. To others, it felt like a verdict on the very idea of fairness in America. Judge Thomas embodied the institution at its most rigid. His bench was more than polished oak, it was a throne of unchecked authority. Each word he spoke carried the weight of centuries of precedent, but also centuries of bias, silence, and selective justice. In his hands, the law was less a tool of equity and more a shield for the powerful. He wielded it with the certainty of someone who believed accountability was for others, never himself. And when he leveled that astronomical penalty, his gaze communicated more than a judgment. It conveyed disdain, as if daring Jasmine to resist. But Jasmine wasn't just a politician seated before him. She carried something far heavier than her own reputation. Her presence in that courtroom was tethered to a lineage of struggle, immigrants who had clawed their way toward dignity, families who had endured discrimination but still dreamed, young people who believed representation meant something real. She sat as their vessel, calm under fire, aware that her silence and her words alike would echo far beyond those four walls. For millions watching, the confrontation became a mirror. They saw in Judge Thomas the familiar face of a system that too often punished the vulnerable while insulating the elite. They saw in Jasmine the quiet resilience of someone who refused to be broken, who carried herself with the unshakable knowledge that truth, though often silenced, cannot be erased. This wasn't about numbers on a ledger, it was about the soul of justice itself. The storm was already brewing. Commentators outside the courthouse framed it as the showdown of the year. Community leaders warned of the dangerous precedent. Social media churned with outrage. How could one judge impose such an impossible burden on a single representative, especially one whose only crime seemed to be speaking truth with too much clarity? Every post, every comment, every whispered conversation fueled the rising stakes. Because deep down, everyone knew, this battle was bigger than Jasmine Crockett versus Judge Thomas. It was the embodiment of two Americas, the one that clings to hierarchy, intimidation, and silence, and the one that insists on dignity, equality, and courage. Each side was staring at the other across the gulf of history, waiting for the next move. And even as Judge Thomas sought to cement his dominance with numbers so absurd they felt surreal, the atmosphere shifted. People were no longer asking whether Jasmine could withstand the punishment. They were asking whether the system itself could withstand the spotlight her defiance was about to cast. The courtroom, the courthouse steps, the news cycles, they all became arenas of anticipation. Something was coming. Something that could not be contained by a fine or a gavel. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a test of America's identity, of who held the moral high ground in a fight that reached into every home, every community, every heart that had ever wondered whether justice was truly blind. This wasn't just a courtroom battle, it was America's soul on trial. Judge Thomas had always carried himself like a man who believed the system existed for him, not the other way around. From the early days of his career, whispers followed him, of rulings that bent heavily in favor of corporations over workers, of decisions that consistently silenced the marginalized while protecting entrenched elites. His ascent through the ranks was less about fairness and more about loyalty to power. He understood the game, and he played it ruthlessly. To the public, he wrapped himself in the language of tradition, quoting scripture and precedent as if they were interchangeable shields. He preached about discipline, about respect for authority, about the sacredness of the law. But behind closed doors, his actions betrayed another story, one of favoritism, of backroom deals whispered over private dinners, of a man more interested in preserving his stature than preserving justice. He carried the arrogance of someone who had never truly been challenged, someone who believed robes could mask rot. Controversy followed him like a shadow. In one case, he sided against environmental protections, allowing industrial giants to pollute rivers that fed small towns, later revealed to be towns he had never once visited, communities whose names he mispronounced when reading the verdict. In another, he struck down labor protections for immigrant workers, framing it as defending economic freedom, while conveniently ignoring the fact that the very businesses profiting from that ruling had donated generously to his allies. Each decision painted the same portrait, Thomas as the patron saint of the privileged, cloaking self-interest in the garb of legality. His elitist posture wasn't limited to the courtroom. In public appearances, he dismissed critics with a wave of his hand, smirking at journalists who dared ask uncomfortable questions. He often spoke about personal responsibility, while sidestepping questions about his own lavish lifestyle, funded, some whispered, by relationships that blurred ethical lines. He claimed to be a defender of integrity, yet seemed allergic to transparency. The contradictions piled up like bricks in a wall meant to keep scrutiny out. And then there was his treatment of those who came before him. Stories circulated of how he belittled defendants, interrupted attorneys mid-sentence, and spoke down to witnesses as though reminding them of their place. To Thomas, the bench wasn't a platform of service, it was a pedestal of dominance. He relished the power imbalance, the way a simple word from his lips could alter the course of someone's life. For many, he came to symbolize the very thing they distrusted about the justice system, a man whose robes gave him cover to practice favoritism, whose smile masked contempt, whose verdicts revealed more about who he wanted to protect than about what was right. And yet, because he wielded authority with confidence, because he wrapped corruption in the language of order, he continued to climb unchecked. Few dared to call him out. Fewer still managed to survive the backlash if they tried. That was what made the $500 million fine more than a ruling. It was Thomas in pure form, brazen, overreaching, a display meant to remind the world of his dominance. In his mind, it wasn't just about punishing Jasmine Crockett, it was about reminding every challenger, every dissenter, every rising voice that he was untouchable. The sheer audacity of the amount was the arrogance of his career condensed into a single act. But arrogance always carries a blind spot. In reaching so high, Thomas had exposed himself. For years, he thrived in the shadows of technicalities, manipulating the fine print, slipping past accountability because the stakes were lower and the spotlight dimmer. But this time, the stage was different. This time, the cameras were rolling, the audience was vast, and his victim wasn't a nameless defendant with no platform. It was Jasmine Crockett, a woman whose strength came not just from her position, but from the millions who saw themselves in her struggle. And so, even as Thomas leaned back in his chair with the air of a man who had won, even as he savored the silence that followed his pronouncement, he didn't see the fissures forming beneath his own feet. His legacy of contradictions, his pattern of arrogance, his history of wielding power like a weapon, they weren't invisible anymore. They were magnified, exposed, and about to be turned against him. Because the truth about villains is simple. They never imagine the moment when their own script betrays them. They never believe their pedestal can crumble. But every villain writes the script of their own downfall. Long before she sat in that courtroom, long before her name made headlines and her words trended across social media, Jasmine Crockett carried the weight of a story bigger than her own. She was the daughter of a community that had endured, resisted, and survived. Her roots stretched into neighborhoods where hard work wasn't a choice but a lifeline, where parents worked double shifts to keep food on the table, and where children learned early that dignity was something you defended daily. Her childhood wasn't gilded in privilege. While Judge Thomas grew up with doors that opened easily, Jasmine came of age pushing through doors that were bolted shut. She watched her neighbors struggle with housing that was promised but never delivered, with schools that were underfunded, with justice that always seemed delayed or denied. In those streets, she saw both the hardship and the hope, the single mother juggling 3 jobs, the immigrant father driving taxis at night while studying English by day, the grandmother who stretched every dollar but still found a way to give. These were the people who carved resilience into her bones. Education wasn't just a personal pursuit for Jasmine, it was an act of defiance. Every book she opened was a statement that she would not be confined by the limits others tried to place on her. Teachers told her she had a gift, but they also warned her about the obstacles, the biases, the glass ceilings, the subtle and not so subtle ways the system would try to silence her. She absorbed their words, but instead of shrinking, she sharpened. The more she saw, the more determined she became, not just to succeed for herself, but to carry with her the stories of those who had given her strength. Law school wasn't easy. She was often the only woman of color in the room, sometimes the only voice daring to challenge the easy consensus. While others debated hypotheticals, Jasmine thought about real families she had known, about immigrants facing deportation, about young people targeted by unjust policing, about workers cheated out of wages. Every case study reminded her of a face, a story, a community left behind. Her classmates admired her fire, but some dismissed her as too idealistic. They didn't understand that her idealism was forged in reality, that every radical idea she defended was rooted in lives she had seen firsthand. When she entered public service, it wasn't for the prestige. It was for the people who rarely felt the law worked for them. She represented clients who couldn't afford high-powered attorneys, she stood beside families who felt invisible, and she refused to bow when powerful opponents tried to intimidate her. Her reputation grew, not as someone chasing headlines, but as someone who spoke hard truths without flinching. Communities trusted her because she listened, because she showed up, because she carried herself with a moral compass that always pointed toward justice. Her sacrifices were real. Nights spent away from her family, threats sent to her inbox, moments of exhaustion when the fight seemed endless. But Jasmine never measured her worth in comfort, she measured it in impact. Each time she stood up for someone without a voice, each time she challenged a system stacked against the vulnerable, she recommitted to the mission that had shaped her from the beginning. Her immigrant community never forgot her. In gatherings at local churches, in cultural festivals, in quiet conversations at kitchen tables, her name carried weight. They saw in her a reflection of themselves, their struggles, their hopes, their sacrifices. She wasn't speaking from an ivory tower, she was speaking from the very ground they walked every day. And when she rose to prominence, she didn't distance herself from them. She carried their stories with her into every chamber, every microphone, every courtroom. That was why the fine levied by Judge Thomas struck such a nerve. It wasn't just about Jasmine, it was about everyone she represented. To punish her so brutally was to send a message that their voices, too, could be crushed. But those who knew her story knew better. Jasmine was not someone who could be silenced by intimidation. Her life had been a long apprenticeship in resilience. Every obstacle had been a test, every injustice a lesson, every struggle a preparation. And so, as she sat before the judge, calm and unflinching, she wasn't just a politician facing a ruling. She was the daughter of sacrifice, the product of resilience, the embodiment of a community's unbreakable spirit. The fine was meant to reduce her, but in truth, it magnified her. It reminded the world that she wasn't standing there alone. She carried the weight of millions who saw themselves in her, who drew courage from her composure, who believed in her because she had always believed in them. The judge thought he was cornering her. What he didn't realize was that Jasmine had lived her entire life in corners, and she had learned not just how to survive there, but how to fight her way out, stronger, louder, unbroken. Everything she had endured had prepared her for this moment. The silence that followed the announcement of the fine quickly gave way to the clash of words. Judge Thomas adjusted his glasses, his voice sharp and commanding as he repeated the staggering figure, as if daring anyone to question his authority. $500 million, he declared again, leaning forward as though the weight of the number alone could crush Jasmine. His tone carried a mixture of arrogance and finality, the smug cadence of a man who believed the conversation was already over. But Jasmine did not flinch. She sat upright, her hands folded calmly on the table before her. The stillness of her body contrasted with the storm brewing in the chamber. When she finally spoke, her words were even and deliberate. Respectfully, Your Honor, justice is not a commodity to be auctioned off. The statement landed softly, but it rippled through the air, and the crowd stirred, sensing the first spark of defiance. Thomas bristled. This is not about justice, it's about accountability, he shot back, his voice rising. The more he spoke, the more his tone betrayed frustration, as though Jasmine's composure itself was an act of rebellion. He jabbed at her reputation, painted her as reckless, accused her of undermining the sanctity of the court. His words were weapons, flung across the chamber with increasing force. Jasmine answered each accusation with the same steadiness. Her voice carried not the tremor of fear but the weight of conviction. Accountability, she replied, is not measured by who can be silenced with the largest number. It is measured by truth. Each phrase was measured, sharp enough to pierce the noise without ever betraying anger. Her restraint became its own power, and the audience leaned closer, drawn into the rhythm of the exchange. The courtroom grew tense, almost unbearable in its intensity. Onlookers whispered nervously, journalists scribbled furiously, and the hum of recording devices captured every breath. Thomas's words grew louder, harsher, infused with the frustration of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. His gavel struck the desk once, then again, as if to punctuate his dominance. But dominance was slipping from his grasp, and everyone in the room felt it. Jasmine, meanwhile, grew stronger with every response. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm became a mirror, reflecting Thomas's unraveling demeanor back at him. Each time he pressed harder, she answered with dignity. Each time he tried to corner her, she widened the frame, reminding the room that this was bigger than one fine, one judge, one courtroom. By now, the tension was palpable. It felt less like a legal proceeding and more like the slow crescendo of a symphony, every note building toward something no one could yet name. The clash was no longer about legal arguments, it was about moral authority. And as Thomas's voice cracked under the strain, Jasmine's steadiness grew luminous, undeniable. The audience could feel it in their bones. Something extraordinary was about to happen. Every eye was fixed on Jasmine, every ear tuned to the cadence of her words, every heart beating faster in anticipation. It wasn't just a courtroom anymore, it was a stage, and the drama unfolding was electric. And then, in a moment so subtle it almost went unnoticed, the balance shifted. Thomas's frustration boiled over, Jasmine's composure radiated strength. The contrast was complete, arrogance against dignity, fury against calm. The energy in the room changed, and those who watched knew instinctively what was coming. The tables were about to turn. The air in the courtroom was heavy, charged, as if the very walls could sense what was about to unfold. Judge Thomas leaned forward, his voice a low growl as he tried one last time to reassert control. Representative Crockett, he said, you stand before this court as a reminder of what happens when arrogance collides with authority. $500 million, that is the cost of your recklessness. He smirked, believing he had punctuated the moment with finality. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't shuffle her papers or fumble for words. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her silence stretching long enough to make even the judge uncomfortable. And then, with a voice steady enough to command the entire chamber, she began. Your Honor, she said, her eyes locked on his, recklessness is hiding corruption behind the robe of justice. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The audience gasped. Reporters dropped their pens for a split second before scrambling to record. Thomas blinked, taken aback by the precision of her opening strike. Jasmine allowed the silence to linger, letting the impact soak in. Then she leaned forward, her tone still calm, but every syllable laced with steel. You call this fine accountability. But accountability isn't punishing those who speak truth, it's holding power accountable when it betrays the people it's supposed to serve. And I will not be silenced for pointing out that betrayal. The room erupted in murmurs. Thomas slammed his gavel once, twice, his voice cracking as he barked for order. But no amount of pounding could drown out the momentum Jasmine had just unleashed. She continued, pulling out documents, records, and statements, receipts of hypocrisy laid bare for all to see. She cited his past rulings that shielded corporations while workers suffered, his decisions that stripped protections from immigrant families, his convenient defenses of the elite under the guise of law. Each fact landed like a hammer, not shouted, but delivered with surgical precision. This court has sided with polluters over children who drink the water. This court has sided with corporations over workers struggling to make ends meet. And this court, she said, her voice rising just enough, has sided with intimidation over justice. Tell me, Your Honor, which of those rulings reflects accountability? The audience stirred, gasps cascading like waves. Some clapped before quickly silencing themselves under the bailiff's glare. Cameras zoomed tighter on Thomas's face, which had shifted from smug certainty to visible irritation. His jaw tightened, his grip on the gavel white-knuckled. Jasmine paused again, letting the tension grow unbearable before pressing forward. You accuse me of arrogance, she said, yet arrogance is assuming the people will remain blind forever. Arrogance is believing that your power is untouchable. Arrogance is confusing fear with respect. The murmurs grew louder. Journalists exchanged glances. This was no longer just testimony, it was a takedown. Clips of her words were already being texted, tweeted, streamed live. Somewhere out there, millions were hearing this in real time, and hashtags were beginning to form. Thomas interrupted, his voice raised. That is enough, he thundered, slamming his gavel again. But the crack of would no longer commanded silence. It sounded hollow, desperate, a symbol of authority slipping away. Jasmine didn't raise her voice to match his. Instead, she lowered it, forcing the room to lean in. You can shout, Your Honor. You can pound your gavel until it splinters. But what you cannot do, what you will never do, is erase the truth. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in awe. A wave of gasps, a smattering of applause, quickly hushed but undeniable. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone knew it. Thomas's composure began to crumble. He shuffled his papers, his face flushed, his responses growing scattered. For years, he had relied on intimidation, but intimidation failed against the armor of calm conviction. Every attempt to reassert himself only magnified Jasmine's steadiness. His robe no longer looked like a symbol of justice, it looked like a shield he was hiding behind. And then came the crescendo. Jasmine rose from her seat, every movement deliberate. Her voice grew stronger, carrying the weight of millions who saw themselves in her words. You fine me $500 million, thinking you could break me. But let me tell you, Your Honor, I am not the sum of your number. I am the voice of the people you tried to silence, and their dignity is priceless. Applause broke out, this time unstoppable. The bailiff's shouts were drowned in the sound of clapping hands, stamping feet, a roar of approval that shook the chamber. Cameras flashed like lightning. Clips of the moment would flood social media within minutes, replayed again and again as the defining turning point. Jasmine lifted her hand, and the room quieted just enough for her closing words. You thought today would end with my humiliation, but history will remember whose arrogance was exposed. And it won't be mine. The silence that followed was deafening, not out of respect for the judge, but out of reverence for what had just been said. Thomas slumped slightly, his face pale, his authority fractured in real time. The courtroom no longer belonged to him. And as Jasmine sat down, her composure unbroken, the audience knew instinctively, they had just witnessed a moment that would reverberate far beyond that room. Clips were already trending, hashtags already spreading, conversations already igniting across the country. And once the dust settled, the shockwave spread far beyond that courtroom. The courtroom had barely emptied before the first clips of Jasmine's takedown began to explode across social media. A single 30-second snippet, her calm voice declaring, "You can pound your gavel until it splinters, but you cannot erase the truth," spread like wildfire. Within an hour, it was the most shared video on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Hashtags ignited like sparks catching dry kindling. Hashtag truth over power, hashtag Jasmine speaks, hashtag priceless dignity. The sound of applause from the courtroom became a soundtrack remixed into reels and shorts, amplified by millions who had waited for someone to speak the words she had just unleashed. Commentators flooded the airwaves. On cable news, anchors replayed the exchange in slow motion, dissecting every raised eyebrow of Judge Thomas, every pause Jasmine had so carefully commanded. Political analysts marveled at her composure, noting how she had managed not only to defend herself but to redefine the terms of the confrontation. One headline captured the mood of the nation: Crockett didn't just survive, she triumphed. But the reaction didn't stop at pundits and news desks. It surged outward into the lifeblood of the country itself. In coffee shops, strangers showed each other clips on their phones. On buses, commuters watched with earbuds in, shaking their heads in disbelief at Thomas's arrogance, then smiling at Jasmine's unflinching reply. College students chanted her words in dorm hallways. Children mimicked her cadence in classrooms, their teachers smiling at the way dignity had suddenly become cool. Celebrities joined the chorus. A-list actors tweeted their admiration. Musicians posted videos of themselves quoting her speech, some setting her words to beats that turned into instant viral tracks. Athletes spoke about courage under pressure, comparing her poise to the calmest moments on the biggest stages of sports. Activists across the spectrum rallied behind her, calling the takedown a turning point in the broader fight for justice. Even political rivals, grudgingly or otherwise, acknowledged what had happened. Some attempted to downplay it, dismissing it as grandstanding. But their voices were drowned out by the tidal wave of support that Jasmine's moment had unleashed. For every dismissive comment, 1,000 voices rose in defense, reminding skeptics that this wasn't performance, it was survival, truth spoken in the face of intimidation. The shock waves reached places no one expected. In small towns, immigrant families gathered around kitchen tables to watch the clip again and again, tears in their eyes as they explained to their children why it mattered. "She's standing for us," parents whispered, as kids absorbed the lesson that dignity was a force stronger than wealth or power. In big cities, activists organized impromptu rallies, projecting Jasmine's words on the sides of buildings, turning her defiance into public art. Even within the legal community, rumblings began. Young law students cited her speech as an example of courage that textbooks had never shown. Judges and attorneys, some quietly, some openly, acknowledged that Thomas had overreached, that Jasmine's response had exposed fault lines too long ignored. What had begun as a single courtroom confrontation was spilling into conversations about reform, accountability, and the future of justice itself. The movement was no longer about one representative or one fine. It was about the people who saw themselves in her: immigrants, workers, mothers, fathers, dreamers, citizens who had long felt the system stacked against them. Jasmine's words had transformed from personal defense into collective anthem. As one commentator on national television put it, this wasn't a defense, it was a declaration. And the country heard it loud and clear. By the end of the week, marches were being planned under banners quoting her speech. Artists painted murals of her standing tall, microphone in hand, defiance etched across her face. Hashtags solidified into slogans. Support groups formed online, connecting strangers who shared stories of times they too had been silenced or dismissed. Jasmine had lit a spark, and the spark had become a fire. Judge Thomas, meanwhile, found himself at the center of an entirely different storm. Editorials questioned his impartiality, watchdog groups began digging into his past rulings with renewed vigor, and protesters appeared outside his courthouse holding signs that read, "Justice shouldn't be for sale." His authority, once unquestioned, was unraveling in real time under the scrutiny Jasmine had forced into the open. And yet, for Jasmine, it was never about vengeance. Her victory was not in Thomas's unraveling, but in the hope she had restored. To millions, she became more than a politician. She became a symbol, a reminder that truth, when spoken with courage, could reverberate far beyond the moment it was uttered. This wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. When the storm of applause faded and the headlines began to settle, Jasmine didn't frame her ordeal as a personal victory. She refused to make it about herself alone. Standing before cameras, microphones, and a nation that now hung on her every word, she lifted the conversation to a higher plane. This was never about a number, she said, her voice steady, resolute. This was about whether dignity can be bought, whether truth can be buried under intimidation, whether justice belongs to the people, or only to those who hold power. And let me tell you, dignity is not for sale. Justice is not for rent. And truth will never be silenced. The words washed over her audience like a tide. People who had never stepped foot in a courtroom felt included in that moment, as though she were speaking directly to them. The immigrant mother who had struggled for years to secure a home for her children nodded with tears in her eyes. The factory worker who had watched his wages stolen by loopholes clenched his fist in agreement. The student who feared their voice wouldn't matter in politics suddenly felt a surge of belonging. Jasmine's ordeal became a parable. She painted the fine not as a punishment, but as proof of the system's fragility. If a judge must wield a $500 million penalty to try to silence one woman, she declared, what does that tell us about his fear of the truth she carries? The question lingered, rhetorical yet piercing. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was exposing the hollowness of intimidation as a tool of power. Her tone shifted from explanation to inspiration, each word a crescendo in the symphony of resistance. We live in a country built on the promise that every person's voice matters, she reminded them. But promises are only as strong as our willingness to fight for them. This fight is not mine alone. This fight belongs to all of us, every immigrant who dared to dream, every worker who demanded fairness, every community that refuses to bow. The crowd that gathered outside erupted in cheers, some chanting her name, others chanting simply, "Our fight, our fight." It spread like a wave across the plaza, the chant becoming rhythm, the rhythm becoming anthem. Jasmine pressed on. When they try to break one of us, they are testing all of us. And when we rise together, when we remind them that dignity cannot be priced, that justice cannot be bought, we prove something powerful, that the soul of this nation does not belong to the arrogant or the corrupt. It belongs to the people who keep fighting, no matter the cost. Her words pierced beyond the political moment into something timeless. Parents began quoting her to their children at dinner tables. Teachers repeated her lines in classrooms. Activists etched her phrases onto placards. The speech became less about Jasmine as an individual and more about the collective strength of those who saw themselves reflected in her struggle. By the time she finished, the atmosphere was electric but reverent. She lowered her voice for the final note, almost a whisper that carried louder than any shout. They thought they were punishing me. But what they did was remind us of who we are. We are a people who will not be silenced. We are a people who will not be priced. We are a people who believe in justice, and we are willing to fight for it. My fight is your fight. Your fight is mine. And together, we cannot lose. The crowd exploded, not in chaos but in unity. It was the sound of a nation reminded of its promise, of ordinary people realizing that their dignity was intertwined with hers. For a moment, the divisions that so often fractured them faded, replaced by a collective heartbeat that pulsed with courage and resolve. Her fight was their fight. And the message was unmistakable. This wasn't just survival, it was transformation. The story that began with a $500 million fine ended with something Judge Thomas never expected. Tears, not triumph. The man who once sat cloaked in arrogance, pounding his gavel as if it were a weapon, now found himself diminished, his authority unraveling under the weight of truth. Jasmine's response didn't just counter his ruling, it revealed the hollowness behind his power. And in that revelation, the man who thought himself untouchable was left shaken, his composure cracked for all the world to see. Her response brought him to tears. Not because she shouted, not because she played his game, but because she did the opposite. She chose dignity over rage, truth over fear. And that choice carried more power than any ruling, any robe, any gavel. This moment was never just about one courtroom. It was about us, about the kind of country we want to live in, about the courage we expect from those who claim to serve, about the dignity that every person deserves. Jasmine stood tall not only for herself, but for everyone who has ever been told to stay silent, to sit down, to accept less than justice. And now, that torch passes to you. Her fight is your fight. Your voice is needed, your courage matters, your presence changes the story. If you believe that truth can still triumph, if you believe that dignity is priceless, then join this movement. Share this story. Stand with Jasmine. Stand with justice. Because the battle for America's soul isn't over, it's only beginning. And together, we will win.